Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled FDA Outlook for 2022. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Joanne, Hawana, and Ben Zegarelli, thank you for joining us. Joanne Hawana is a member of the law firm Mintz, practicing in the Health FDA Group and based in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. He counsels global clients on the business impact of new U.S. federal and state actions related to drugs, biologics, cellular therapies, foods, and medical devices. Her counseling and compliance support work reaches into all aspects of FDA-regulated companies' operations, including determining regulatory status of novel products, pre-market and post-market compliance requirements, and enforcement-related matters. She also provides regulatory expertise to her colleagues in class action and other litigation involving FDA-regulated products, and she works with the Mintz corporate and securities practice on transactions and offerings for companies regulated by the FDA. Joanne has a master's degree in molecular genetics from UMBNJ and a bachelor's degree in biology from the College of William and Mary. She received her JD from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law in 2007. Benjamin Zegarelli is of counsel at the law firm Mintz, practicing in the Health FDA Group and based in the firm's New York office. He provides counsel to a breadth of healthcare industry clients, including pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech companies, on the federal and state laws surrounding medical product development and marketing. In particular, Benjamin has extensive experience guiding medical device companies through the FDA regulatory process to identify the correct regulatory pathway, assisting with communications and meetings with FDA, ensuring that regulatory submissions meet regulatory requirements, and helping to establish robust post-market quality system and compliance controls. His practice also includes representing both clinical trial sponsors and clinical sites on clinical research issues, including government grant regulations, as well as drafting and negotiating the agreements necessary to perform clinical research. Benjamin has a master's degree in organic chemistry from the California Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Middlebury College. He received his JD from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in 2013. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Joanne.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate, and thanks to the whole Medmarc team for inviting us to present today and for making this presentation possible. We're really excited to be here. I'm going to briefly introduce our plan for this afternoon. And as Heather mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we do welcome your questions throughout, and certainly your comments or any thoughts that you may have on these topics. The purpose of today is sort of to look forward. What is FDA working on? What are the expectations for 2022? There is obviously a lot going on, and we maybe should have asked Medmarc to give us 2 hours rather than 1, but we'll try to get through as much as we can today. And again, that's why we would love your input to, again, further refine what is most of value to the audience. But in terms of what we've prepared today, the hot topics, of course, would be transitioning from pandemic marketed products and emergency use authorizations into more normal marketing authorizations, and again how that affects the industry in terms of timing and planning for that kind of transition. So we'll start with that. Another hot topic is laboratory developed tests, what the expectations are for potential reform in that industry. We have regulatory considerations permitting greater patient and consumer accessibility to devices. So at the home use, or even in some cases at the point of care. But really, we wanted to talk about home use of devices and really other medical products. There's sort of a macro trend of shifting to consumer self-diagnosis, self-treatment, and all of that, as you all likely know. And then there's a lot happening at the drug and biologics centers in terms of programmatic reforms, pretty major shifts in staffing and funding and all those fun things that keep the agency moving. So we'll touch on those. There's certainly always enforcement and inspectional activities that are happening. And again, certainly with the pandemic, there's an increase in, for example, the use of import alerts to keep for certain foreign produced products out and things like that. So we'll again touch on that. And then, as most people probably know, we should have a fully Senate-confirmed FDA Commissioner, hopefully in the next few weeks. And so we will try to look forward as to what Commissioner Rob Califf would, prioritize once he takes over the agency from our current acting commissioner. As you guys probably know, this is the longest time the agency has had an acting commissioner. So it's been that in and of itself is a very interesting development, but we will be, again, looking forward more so than looking back. So we'll focus on what Dr. Califf what his tenure may bring. And then we have sort of a fun, we call it lightning round, lots of other things happening besides those 5 bullets. And again, that's where we love more input from the group. So I'm going to first just kick off our transitioning topic, and then I'll let Ben really fill in the details there. But I think most people know that the majority of the products that FDA has authorized under EUAs, or certainly in the enforcement discretion space, have been devices and diagnostics in particular, right? All the COVID tests. But besides that, this slide will show you that there's EUAs, and then there's a ton of enforcement discretion policies that were primarily, pushed out in 2020, early on in the pandemic, to help our response to, the emergency situation, and allowing existing products to be modified in order to respond. And so, there's two pieces here: what happens to EUA products, and then what happens to products that have been marketed under these various enforcement policies with modifications. So, and again, the reason we mention, we're focusing on device is just because there's a much smaller universe of EUA drugs and certainly vaccines. And as we saw earlier this year with the Pfizer vaccine, transitioning that product from an emergency use authorization to a full, approval through a BLA was just a case-by-case thing. So I wouldn't expect, some huge guidance to come out from CBER or CDER on, transitioning those types of products, the therapeutic products. Whereas in device world, it's just, there's thousands, right? So as a result of that, in late December, right before Christmas, CDRH, and I will pause here. We'll use the acronyms because we assume the audience knows those. But CDRH is the Center for Devices, CBER is the Center for Biologics, CDER is the Center for Drugs. So just I'll set that level setting, but go from here on out, we'll just use the acronyms. So right before Christmas, CDRH did put out some early proposals for what that transition will look like. And I'll have Ben talk about, what that proposal is and what our expectations are for that process.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. As Joanne was mentioning, COVID obviously introduced a lot of confusion and new opportunities to use different devices and develop devices to help combat COVID as countermeasures. So there was the emergency use authorization side, which provided a route to get these products on the market and authorized by FDA, whereas the enforcement policies were more directed at existing devices and, as Joanne was saying, modifications or new uses that may not quite have been within the actual approval or clearance of those devices. So allowing for a little bit more flexibility. Obviously now FDA has extended this opportunity for flexibility. It's a bit difficult to remove that flexibility abruptly. So the transition plan is a way, and especially issuing it at this point in the pandemic, allows stakeholders to understand where FDA is going to go with this, the actual process involved. And we should emphasize it hasn't started yet. The transition has not, the initial date for the transition has not started. This is just FDA floating its proposal for how this transition will happen. But it's good that they're doing it early so that manufacturers and other stakeholders can make ready and be prepared for that process. So there are two different guidances. There's one for the transition of enforcement policy devices, which are under these numerous enforcement policies that you can see as our background for this slide. We just thought we would show you how many there are. There are even more than what is pictured here. Then there's also a separate transition plan for emergency use authorization devices. So the transition plans look very similar. The total transition period is 180 days. So, and that's going to begin when FDA issues a notice, ostensibly to the public, but also to all manufacturers that the transition period is starting. You need to get everything lined up in order to make sure that your products, if you intend to market them after the transition period is over, that you start the process of submitting a full market application to FDA. So that 180 days, that first day will mark the start of that 180-day period. The two transition plans are broken up into different phases, but ultimately the main thing to remember is that by the time that 180 days comes, the final date of that transition period, a manufacturer must have a marketing submission into FDA if it intends to market the enforcement policy device or EUA device beyond that transition period. If a manufacturer is going to cease production and distribution of a COVID-related device under a policy or an EUA, then FDA would prefer to have notification of that. They want to have affirmative notice that the manufacturer intends to terminate production distribution and have a plan in place for removing the devices from the market. And that's essentially the full process that FDA is thinking about, again, with additional details articulated in the plan. So we're going to see, this probably isn't going to start anytime soon, but we're going to see FDA talk about it more, and certainly around the time that the public health emergency is going to end, FDA will start instituting this to make sure that these devices and products can transition out. But what's important to keep in mind for manufacturers and other stakeholders here is that those marketing submissions should probably be prepared well in advance of the end of the transition period, because there's going to be a lot of planning, potentially data collection, verification, validation, other testing that may need to happen, and then the actual preparation of the submission itself. And considering the backlog of other applications already at CDRH, whether they're 510Ks, de novos, or PMAs, it's a good idea to get your submission in sooner rather than later, because the backlog will likely only increase because of all the manufacturers out there that will need to get 510Ks or de novos or PMAs for these enforcement policy devices or EUA devices.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question on that, Ben. Is it at all clear that all of these products will have an obvious route to market? So, for example, a predicate to do a 510K on. And I think actually it could be a good transition to our next topic, which was the lab developed tests. And, you know, the fact, we'll talk about in a minute, the fact that the policy now is that lab developed tests for COVID do require an EUA. But, you know, it seems to me unclear as to what happens to lab developed tests with an EUA at the point of the end of the transition period, or again, when the transition period begins, in terms of getting a real, you know, a formal marketing application in for such a product. And that,
I mean, it's a great point, and we're going to talk about the LDT policy in just a second. But I mean, I think in terms of other devices, like the enforcement policy devices, I think they'll have an easier time getting through the submission and clearance process and potentially approval. A lot of the devices included in those enforcement policies are, they're already on the market. There are already types of devices that are in the commercial space. So there are ready predicates. In many cases, it's just the manufacturer's own device that they've modified. So it's easier to get that through FDA rather than create a totally new marketing submission. And hopefully, I don't know how FDA is going to leverage this their experience already with the EUAs, but presumably there's already some institutional knowledge of these devices, especially the IVDs or COVID tests that have already gone through the EUA process. So hopefully they'll streamline that a bit since they already have some experience with those devices. But the main point that you made at the end, which is a really interesting one, is now that FDA's policy since November is that all lab developed tests for COVID need to have an EUA in order to be marketed nationwide. It's a question as to how that's going to work with this transition plan. So, to put it in more basic terms, LDTs now require an EUA to be on the market. If the transition plan says that for EUA devices, you need to have this transition plan and submit a marketing application, that implies that an LDT would also need to go through that process. The problem is that FDA doesn't have wide-ranging authority yet, as far as we know, to regulate LDTs fully. Now, and there's been, over the previous decades, number of years, FDA has practiced enforcement discretion when it comes to LDTs. But now that they've asserted specific authority over COVID LDTs, does that mean that COVID LDTs will now require a 510K, a de novo, a PMA to be on the market? It's unclear. It would be a little strange if FDA is all of a sudden expected to apply enforcement discretion to all other LDTs, but then just for COVID, you need a marketing application. Certainly FDA has requested voluntary submissions for LDTs in the past, but I don't think a lot of clinical labs have taken FDA up on that. So it's an interesting question going into this process.
Yeah, I think it really is an area that they're going to have to provide a lot more clarity on. And I know Heather put in the chat for everybody, Medmarc's blog post on those transition guidances. But before we just move on into the LDTs a little more, I just want to encourage people to look at that and to submit comments to that docket. The comment period runs till March 23rd. And, if you have products that are affected, look at it closely. And these issues around, what happens to my lab developed tests at this point? I have an EUA, but I have no clear way to get marketing approval or clearance for that post-transition. Those are excellent comments to, have the agency focus on that a little more when they finalize this. So just wanted to point out that comment period end date. So on the LDTs, I think Ben, you previewed a lot of that. It's not a very clear or consistent policy framework, and we don't certainly need to go too far back. But just, you mentioned November 2021, and what's the relevance of November 2021, and I guess where are we today? I think you said COVID LDTs require an EUA now, but maybe give us a little forward looking on what you think might happen there, or what's happening right now.
Sure. Well, I think this is going to be much more of a joint discussion because there's a lot of speculation as to how this is going to work. But just to give a small bit of history, at the beginning of the pandemic, FDA was asserting its authority over COVID LDTs, and then in August of 2020, in the previous administration, the Department of Health and Human Services essentially said, FDA, you don't have sufficient authority to regulate LDTs or require clinical labs to submit EUA requests for LDTs. So essentially putting to rest the question as to whether FDA even had this authority at all. So then it was essentially an open market for LDTs, at least in the sense that COVID LDTs still needed to be performed by high complexity labs and complying with CLIA and other applicable regulations. But essentially it was an open market for LDTs not having to go through FDA's EUA process. That all changed again, confusingly, in November, when the current administration's Secretary of Health and Human Services reversed that policy and said, "Never mind, we don't have that. That's not our policy anymore." And simultaneously, on the same day, FDA released a revised enforcement policy for COVID tests that essentially said all LDTs for COVID now require an EUA. And importantly, we should also mention that revised policy did a couple of other things, such as ending the enforcement discretion of COVID test distribution prior to receiving an EUA. So now all tests, regardless of whether they're an IVD or an LDT, need to wait until FDA actually provides authorization before marketing and distributing a COVID test. So that was an important change as well. But essentially, from my previous discussion, sort of thrown back into the spotlight how the government in general and FDA are going to treat LDTs going forward. What are going to be the regulatory implications and constraints that apply to LDTs? And that as far as I know, there's no direct FDA response to that question. We know FDA wants to regulate LDTs, but they've been sort of quiet about it since 2014. But there is the possibility of legislation. So Joanne, why don't you talk about the VALID Act for a minute?
Yeah. So in terms of here, how the laws and regulations might change, I mean, certainly FDA could assert its authority more strongly or outside of COVID LDTs, but I think both of us don't think that's likely given what happened previously. And I know Heather also just put their blog post on LDTs for those, for people that want to read that, and maybe it goes into that history. But it seems more likely that the agency, while doing this here in the context of this public health emergency and in the interest of public safety, because there have been, examples of problematic tests, both LDT tests and IVDs, right, getting out in the last 2 years. So they are being more conservative with their approach to tests in general. I think putting aside criticism of FDA on moving slowly on tests, they're looking out for the public safety. So I don't think they'll really do much outside of COVID until it's clear that they have broad stakeholder support. And the only way they're going to get broad stakeholder support, meaning the lab industry, the device industry, policymakers, everybody, would be through a clear legislative fix here. I mean, the LDT situation has been muddy and unworkable for a decade at least, right? So it's not going to just be agency action. So there is legislation pending. It's bipartisan. It's been introduced twice now. It's called the VALID Act. And it would just create, it's sort of a nice, I guess from a structural standpoint, like a really clean way to do this. Make different product category. So FDA, drugs, devices, will be a brand new product category. It will be called IVCT, in vitro clinical tests. That will comprise both in vitro diagnostics and LDTs. So the definition of an IVCT will be both. And the system will be different for, in terms of, what kind of test it is it grandfathered, it's complex, but as a solution, it, sort of addresses everyone's concerns. And I know, again, we're going to talk about Rob Califf, but I know that Dr. Califf has already expressed an interest in, working with the Senate Health Committee to get something in this vein, get the VALID Act negotiated and through. and really just, he strongly does support the need for what he called a modern framework for the oversight of all in vitro diagnostic tests. So I think between sort of some of the stuff we were talking a minute ago, Ben, in terms of the lack of clarity about what happens when EUAs expire when it comes to LDTs, and bipartisan support, mostly industry support, and an incoming commissioner that strongly supports it. Maybe we'll get some diagnostic reform legislation this year. And I think with the user fees also this summer, and we'll talk a little bit about the user fees. As folks know, that's a 5-year reauthorization cycle that FDA's PDUFA, MDUFA programs have to go through. That is often a vehicle for FDA reforms. I mean, I think folks that work on the Hill sometimes say there's no way VALID Act is getting attached to the user fee bill, but you never know. Crazier things have happened. So whether it passes alone or on something like that, I think it just has come to such a head that something has to change.
It's a huge reform, and there's still some contentious issues in it. I know there's still a lot of advocacy going on around the VALID Act and how to tweak it here and there. Mostly, I think it's coming together. I think there's a lot of support for it moving forward, but there's going to be a lot of tweaking that needs to happen. We were talking about this before, Joanne and I. She was expressing more optimism that the VALID Act may be the solution to the conundrum about LDTs and COVID and how they're going to be marketed after. And I was saying, I don't know. I think there's going to be more confusion. It's going to be it's going to get a little hairy before the VALID Act comes in to clean it up. But maybe it's possible. It does seem like the issue is becoming untenable to a certain extent. So I think we're going to see more push for that legislation to happen. So we'll see.
Yep. Maybe Rob Califf to the day saves the day or something. Okay. Well, I think actually this is a great transition. I know that one thing that labs and other test developers have struggled with a little bit because of the lack of clarity from FDA, although maybe for other reasons too, but there's definite lack of clarity here, is around the ability for people to collect specimens at home, do testing right from home. And, this again is one piece of, our next topic, which is really various activities that the agency is doing and will be doing to increase, patient and consumer accessibility of devices at home. I think this, COVID has clearly accelerated that trend, but it existed before the pandemic. And again, in the context of testing, the specimen collection kits or specimen collection devices, rather, I should say, IVDs are regulated by FDA as in vitro diagnostics. And there's a lot of confusion around that. And I know, we've addressed it, probably other folks have addressed it. But again, it's sort of only one piece. There's other types of devices that are getting, pushed into consumers' homes. It's part of the movement that, investors and, a lot of startup and other client companies will say, right, the democratization of healthcare as again, this macro trend that we're seeing in the industry. But there are obvious regulatory implications to that, right? Making sure a device is still safe for home use, that a layperson can follow the instructions, to ensure it's actually effective at whatever it's doing. And I think, why we highlight this as a topic is because industry is way ahead of FDA here. I mean, Ben and I have been counseling people, I would say, for at least 6-7 years on, how to make their devices, prescription devices often, right, available in that home setting, and the use of telehealth to engage, allow for the engagement between a doctor and patient, again, has during the pandemic, again, has only increased that need and accelerated that trend. So I think there's going to be a lot more coming from FDA on this topic in general. And I don't know, Ben, if you had some other thoughts you wanted to add here, or actually specifically on the specimen collection devices, right? I know there was some recent changes.
I also just wanted to make the general point, like, I think we're going to find that most of these topics tie back to COVID, just because that's what's going on right now. But, to refer back to our initial topic, which was those enforcement policies, I mean, the pandemic really forced the healthcare industry and the life sciences industry to really broaden their perspectives on telemedicine, making devices and healthcare more accessible to, keep people out of the healthcare institutions where you're more likely to contract an infection potentially. So all of those enforcement policies that we highlighted before for remote monitoring or data collection, using these devices at home, a lot of those enforcement policies discuss those abilities to use modified devices for home use, making devices so that they can be wirelessly connected so that they can share data with a healthcare provider. That's the kind of thinking that FDA had to adopt in order to respond effectively to the pandemic. And it's something that the industry, patients, and healthcare professionals are demanding that the regulatory framework move towards and try to accommodate more of that, especially in light of telemedicine, which has been growing quite a bit since even just a few years ago. So I think we've seen FDA sort of take this approach of needing to reevaluate the risk of all of this whole world, this universe of devices, and try to make sure that the risk profiles are reflected appropriately in the device's classification and the types of controls and regulatory scrutiny they need. And we've seen this, in some specific cases, like Joanne was mentioning, and specifically like with the hearing aid, the OTC hearing aid proposed rule that came out recently. Is that you can see the FDA is making these different analyses, calculations of saying, how can we get more of these devices into the hands of consumers, direct to consumer safely, in a safe way. And I think, the advances in technology have helped FDA become more comfortable that the risks associated with these devices can be mitigated and addressed more directly, and that there isn't as much risk to a consumer. One of the downsides of this, though, is that FDA reevaluates lots of different types of devices in their classifications, and in some cases will increase the classification. One example that we saw of that may have flown under the radar for a lot of people is that FDA reevaluated the regulatory classification of blood lancets. So the little needles that you use to take you stick your finger and you take a little bit of blood, which are used for lots of different purposes. For things like blood glucose testing, or just regular point of care, doctor's office tests, but also for things like in lots of different IVDs or LDTs. Even some COVID testing has used blood. And what's interesting about FDA's up classification of blood lancets to class 2 from class 1, and in some cases all the way to class 3 for reusable blood lancets that can be used on multiple patients, is that FDA has taken this fairly simple type of device and fairly radically changed how it can be used in the marketplace and the regulatory controls attached to it. So, and the reason this is so, I think this is bigger than it might seem, is that a lot of these IVD and LDT specimen collection kits. You need a specimen collection kit in order to get the sample that the lab or the testing facility needs to run the test. So in a lot of cases, a lot of these test developers are trying to have home specimen collection kits where they send a kit directly to the consumer sticks their own finger, collects a little bit of blood, and then sends it off to the lab. Well, now that those kits are considered convenience kits and medical devices by themselves, but also all of the individual components of a convenience kit have to be appropriately classified and cleared or approved for their intended use. So in this case, blood lancets, which used to be exempt because they were class 1 from a pre-market submission, if they're class 2, now they need a clearance, a 510K clearance, and they have to be specifically cleared for at-home use if that's going to be the intended use as part of a convenience kit. So this is going to change a lot about how these convenience kits need to be developed and then assembled and distributed. And there's already a lot of confusion around blood specimen collection kits, especially in the direct consumer market, where a lot of distributors and manufacturers don't always understand that the convenience kit itself is a medical device that is regulated by FDA, and that all the components need to be cleared for their intended use or exempt. So we've dealt with counseled a lot of clients about assembling convenience kits and making sure that it's an assembler that has quality controls in place and is registered with FDA. And that's going to be even more critical now that the blood lancets are at a higher classification.
And it wasn't a blood lancet matter, but I know last year there was a convenience kit related warning letter
yes.
in terms of the kit not having been cleared and the components not being, exempt or otherwise cleared. So yeah, I think that is a pretty significant issue. And you mentioned the OTC Hearing Aid proposal, which is a very big deal. It was mandated by Congress. I don't know that FDA was super excited about it or that it really wanted to do that, but it had to do that. So that proposed rule, came out in October. I believe the comment period has ended. But as an example of how not always straightforward this kind of shift from prescription to OTC or from point of care to home is, the a large number of state attorneys general submitted a letter to that docket, the OTC Hearing Aid docket, and basically are asking FDA to clarify in the final rule that all of these various state laws and various consumer protections that are in place that that are related to hearing aids in general, right? They're just general hearing aid laws, such as you have to be 18 to buy hearing aid. That those state laws would not be preempted by this new, FDA OTC hearing aid rule when it's finalized. And I mean, if you read that attorney's general letter, there's just a slew of concerns that they have. And again, you would think something like that consumers want, that healthcare providers may or may not want, depending what kind of provider you are, but that policymakers think are good for consumers, to make them accessible, make them cheaper, because that's another driving force here. I know we talked about the democratization of healthcare, but there's also the whole healthcare is so expensive in our country, right? And a hearing aid shouldn't cost someone half of their annual salary. They're really expensive. So it's not just drug pricing. It's other things as well, and some of this is getting more things to OTC status also is a healthcare cost issue, again from the policymakers' perspective, not FDA's necessarily, but that's why these things are getting sort of pushed down on the FDA to develop a system. But I just highlight that attorney's general letter because it does really show how complex doing something as simple as this small group of, because it's not all hearing aids, right? This small type of hearing aid or this one single type of hearing aid can be OTC when these controls are met. But again, major concerns at the state level as to what that might mean if it's not clearly not being preempted. So
Yep.
again,
Just to close this out, so we can have time for our other topics. I think we're going to see a lot of development here. We expect more guidance and policies relating to at-home use accessibility, things like that. So we expect this to be an evolving trend over the coming year and in the future.
Yeah, and to be fair, we have devices because there's so much talk about on devices, but it's also on the drug side. So one of the things Dr. Califf has highlighted as a priority would be, getting FDA to finally put out, this prescription OTC shift proposed rule that's been delayed for 4 or 5 years, and that's something he said that's going to be a priority for him because people, the senators in Congress are saying, whatever happened to that proposed rule that you guys promised us or that the agency promised us to make, marketing OTC drugs more straightforward for industry.
Which I believe dovetails well with our next topic.
It does. Thank you, Ben. So our next topic was drug and biologics reform. There's, so much happening. It's hard to capture it all. We'll just go really quickly. I think, on the over-the-counter drug monographs, folks might know that reform at the legislative level already happened. It was part of the 2020 CARES Act. And even though that legislation had been around for a while and had bipartisan support and stuff, it was very surprising that it got tacked on to the CARES Act, which was that first coronavirus relief bill back in March of 2020. And that's why I'm like, well, maybe VALID could get tacked onto something too, because we just saw it happen with this. But because, so FDA moved really quickly once that law was passed, and it spent 2021 really setting up this new OTC drug program. And last time I checked a few days ago, there was 20 final administrative orders. There was one proposed order, which is the sunscreen monograph, or in this case, the sunscreen proposed order, which people are still submitting comments to, and I don't think will be finalized that soon. It's still very, I think the sunscreen area is still very contentious, again, between the agency and the industry and the active ingredients there. There's just a lot of dispute as to what's generally recognized as safe and effective as a sunscreen ingredient. But so just expect a lot more of, those ongoing implementation of this new OTC program. And of course, part of that included new user fees for OTC manufacturers. And certainly if you submit a request for an order, an administrative order, but because they're on the normal cycle of the user fee schedules, which most of the time you get those fee rates for the next fiscal year right before the government's fiscal year starts, October 1. So those notices usually are published, August usually. This over-the-counter new user fee program got added in a weird year, in March, and so the timing of it is all off. And the agency did not want to have industry, especially small companies, pay 2 user fees in the calendar year of 2021. So they, the first notice for fees was early 2021. The second one should be in the next few weeks or couple months. They have said that the user fee deadline to pay it for this fiscal year, will be June 1st. So it's actually an interesting, again, just sort of development and implementation of this new program. And I just do want to remind folks, since we're getting to the end, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat for us. The other thing here is CBER, which is, again, the Center for Biologics. They've already reorganized. They issued a notice at the beginning of January regarding a pretty significant reorganization within CBER and specifically the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies. And that they've been getting, inundated with gene and cell therapy applications, INDs, so for clinical trials mostly, but they're having meetings, they're just overwhelmed with work. And it's clear, everyone knows this, and part of the PDUFA agreement that, hopefully will, again, Congress will pass this summer, but part of that agreement negotiated with industry would give, lots more money to CBER and would involve hiring a lot more people for CDER. And so the reorganization that they announced in the first week of January, it didn't say it was, in anticipation of this influx of money and people, but it's clear they're preparing for that. Some of the existing branches within OTAT were getting, too large to really manage effectively. So they created, a new branch, a gene therapies branch 2. And again, there's very exciting things happening at CDER. Again, not just organizationally, but in terms of the products they're reviewing and getting, and approving. I mean, there's been some really cool regenerative medicine products approved, in 2021. So that's our CBER comment or topic. The last thing on this one is, I think most folks know, because of the Biogen Alzheimer's drug in particular, which, there's been so much press on its approval and the standards and whether the surrogate endpoint there was validated. But beyond that drug, there are, well, actually, I guess it's biologic, but beyond that product, there's a lot of controversy and sort of re-examination of the accelerated approval program. And is it working as intended? Is the fact that, sponsors are not always completing their confirmatory clinical trials after they get that accelerated approval, what does that mean? There's been advisory committees in the last year specifically focused on oncology indications that had what FDA calls, dangling accelerated approval indications, where, that again, that's that verification of efficacy wasn't completed or potentially in some cases not started. So the reforms around that would be, for example, requiring that such a verification study actually be initiated before you get your accelerated approval or something like that. Again, just to further tighten up that program. And I think there's fairly widespread agreement, it's a good program to get products out faster in these settings of, serious unmet needs and seriously life-threatening illnesses. But there's also growing recognition that the program as it's currently constituted just has some gaps. So I think that could be something that Congress tries to address as part of the user fee package this summer, some amendments around the accelerated approval statute. But again, there's a lot happening there. We may have a hearing this year, an accelerated approval withdrawal hearing, which would be only the second administrative hearing ever in this area. And it'll be very different than the first one. So look out for that if accelerated approval is of interest to you. They have not scheduled that hearing yet. It's for the proposed withdrawal of McKenna, the preterm birth drug. So again, I know we're sort of running out of time then. Observations?
Well, I think we just want to cover these topics a little quickly. And if there are questions, we can always pause and jump over to some other topic. We're flexible. But I mean, this slide is really our opportunity to just sort of comment on the various enforcement and inspection actions that have been that FDA has been doing in the recent past, and then also like what we expect to see for the next year. So, I think, again, like I said before, it all comes back to COVID. COVID's really affected the agency's ability to conduct inspections and really do effective enforcement because, the investigators aren't going out to do in-person inspections. And most of the products that come across FDA's desk right now, at least the ones they're focusing on, are related to COVID. So it just stands to reason that a lot of what's going on is COVID related. In terms of enforcement, inspections, FDA had to pause domestic and foreign manufacturer inspections for a while, and they didn't totally go offline. FDA had put out various missives saying that they were focusing on mission critical inspections, but it's caused a lot of delays, especially for companies that have submitted marketing approval submissions, and essentially FDA had said, well, if we can't do a pre-approval inspection, we're going to issue a complete response letter, and we have to wait until we can schedule you for a pre-approval inspection. So, and that was pretty significant for some companies. In other cases, though, FDA was able to bring up remote assessments, so able to do some compliance work virtually, to ask for documents, look at records, and use that a little bit more. Frankly, Joanne, more than I think they ever have, right? I don't think we had seen many record requests before, but that's suddenly become the new MO for FDA to do its compliance work, especially in light of the repeated pauses. So in the fall of last year, I believe FDA sort of said, okay, we're going to start ramping up domestic inspections and we're going to bring back foreign inspections. And then Omicron hit and FDA went back on pause for almost all inspection activity except for mission critical work. So, and that pause was in effect, I think, through January 19th. So they're starting to come back and ramp up again. But
they just extended it again.
They extended it again. Right.
It's till February 4th.
Right. Okay. So still on pause.
Hot off the presses.
Awesome. Yeah. Right. But it's been sort of a roller coaster for FDA's Office of Compliance, and so but we do expect over 2022 that FDA is going to ramp up its inspection activity. But the interesting thing about this is that now maybe there will be more remote assessments, and they'll combine remote assessments with in-person activities for the really critical stuff. But it could actually end up enhancing FDA's ability to look at more manufacturers in less time. Now, of course, FDA doesn't really have a formal policy, either internal or external, about how to conduct remote assessments and how to do that in a regimented way and like have a scheduling and figure out how it'll be done. But FDA has said that it's focusing on getting those policies in place. So I think that's definitely something we're going to be looking out for to see how that's going to affect the industry.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, this last year were the first, warning letters that were issued based on, a review of records responsive to a remote records request, right? Which again is in the statute. It's been there for a while. It's not new. It's just not something they were really relying on as much, before. So I agree with you that there's no reason that you would throw out these great new tools that you now have, that you're now leveraging, and that you're, able to find enough, issues or violations to lead to a warning letter solely based on those written records. And I think one area that's been very clear, if you just scroll through the warning letters or do some searches, is in the food space, and in particular in the Foreign Supplier Verification Program regulations that were part of FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, because U.S. importers, that for those of you that have seen the FSVP regulations, the term importer is incredibly broad, right? And anybody can be an importer of food, including retailers and folks that weren't previously subject to any sort of FDA regulation directly. And because of that, FDA gave folks a lot of time to implement and come into compliance with those FSVP rules. But they did start, I remember, because Ben and I had one of those early, one of our clients had, a retailer client had an FSVP inspection in 2019, and it was one of the first ones. It was right when they announced that, okay, we're going to start actually inspecting and enforcing on these regs. And, now you can tell they're still doing them. They're mostly all just with remote records requests, and there's lots and lots of warning letters. So in that space in particular, there really hasn't been a slowdown in enforcement. And again, we're just, because there is no need for a physical visit to an importer when ultimately what you're looking at for FSBP compliance is records. It's not, is it sanitary enough in your office? Because most importers are, like our client, had an office that the inspector came to. And again, at the time in 2019, we were both like, why is he even bothering going halfway across the state to go to the office? There's nothing.
Just documents.
There.
Yeah, right.
Document.
Written material. Yeah.
So yeah, if you do a quick search, just since 2019, when they started enforcing FSVP, there's over 115 warning letters. I checked this morning, I think it was 116. And a lot of those are from this last year. Again, putting in those, what the FDA has called a resiliency roadmap for inspections and, oversight of all these industries that it keeps an eye on. It's a lot.
Yeah, and then just to comment quickly on the other aspects of enforcement. I mean, we've obviously noticed a large uptick in warning letters and enforcement activities for COVID-related products. I believe the number I saw was that the agency had issued 267 warning letters relating to COVID products. So that's quite a lot of enforcement in the past couple years. And I think FDA said that almost 71% of the respondents were actually, engaged in voluntary compliance. So, but anyway, I mean, we've all seen a lot of fraudulent products and advertisements for those. So, the agency has tried to keep up with that. One of the more interesting ones that we were keeping track of was released in December for Dermacare, which was cited for selling and distributing a COVID test ostensibly for surveillance use, which was the FDA has carved out surveillance testing at the population level from regulatory compliance. But this test, while being sold as a surveillance test, was actually for individual screening, which is a regulated device. So FDA had issued a warning letter saying you marketed it as surveillance, but it's clear based on your instructions and other materials that this is actually a screening test, and so that's not marketed appropriately. You need to take action. So that was, and I think we're going to see more of that. I think FDA has become more aware of various marketing tactics by companies, whether wittingly or unwittingly, I should say, because the line between surveillance and other types of testing has been pretty vague, and the FDA didn't define it very well. But I think it is an area that FDA is focusing on now to really home in on whether these testing products are actually sold with the appropriate intended uses and under the correct authorization.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your view, that Dermacare warning letter from December is maybe just the first of potentially a trend of warnings involving surveillance testing claims, that kind of thing, right? That's
what I would think. Yeah, I mean, we know that the industry has looked for ways to, I don't want to call them like loopholes, but like the ways to not be a fully regulated IVD, right? And try to get something on the market without needing to go through the entire EWA process. And some of those various exemptions are difficult to understand. So I think that's why I said, like, wittingly or unwittingly, I think other companies may have run across that. But I think we're going to see more of that enforcement activity. Yeah. And then as the year goes on, and inspections come back, I assume we'll see a trend back to normal enforcement activities and inspection activities. So we'll look for that as the year goes on too.
Well, what's really interesting before we switch gears again, and I know it's 3, so Medmarc can tell me if we have to stop. We have a hard stop, or if we can keep going.
Us off. Yeah, right.
Cut off our mics. Is the GMP, and especially in the foreign drug space, the CDER, Office of Manufacturing Quality, has been issuing a lot of warning letters. Some of them based on real inspections they maybe got in there, during before Omicron. Some of them are from an inspection that happened in June, but some of them are remote records requests only, and there is clearly a focus on things like foreign over-the-counter drug manufacturing firms that have never been inspected before because they never had a new drug application that required a pre-approval inspection. And so they've sort of flown under the radar. And I think that's certainly a trend that has emerged in the last year. And then I think will absolutely continue, because it's a problem for the agency. And I think for us as American consumers, if there's drugs getting in, over-the-counter drugs that are sold, everywhere, without meeting our standards for quality and safety and efficacy. And some of those warning letters are quite shocking in terms of what those manufacturers usually were not doing. Not what they were doing, what they were not doing, which is, in some cases, like no testing, right? So in terms of stability and things like that, right? So I think that's another area that will continue to just see a lot of enforcement. And so if any of you, use foreign suppliers, maybe just follow up on diligence and make sure they're compliant and, that kind of thing. Tighten up your supply chains, because there's a lot of that, going to the supplier source and, looking for adulterated, misbranded products. And as I mentioned at the very top of the hour, import alerts are also, very popular right now, because it's easy for FDA to put a foreign manufacturer on import alert. And just block them. So that's it is a form of enforcement, but something we've seen a lot of this year as well. So we'll keep going a little bit, and the webinar is going to be recorded. So for those of you that you have to drop for another meeting or something, you'll be able to catch up with us later. So we wanted to just wrap up at least the topics with some thoughts on Dr. Califf. And I should say he's not confirmed by the Senate yet. The full confirmation vote hasn't been scheduled. I would assume it should be scheduled fairly soon, given how many senators have been sort of mad at Biden for not making this nomination many months ago, because that is the longest time we've gone without a confirmed commissioner. Rob Califf is also very unique in that if and when he's confirmed, he'll be the first to ever be confirmed twice by the Senate for this role, which is sort of cool.
And we want to point out, just in case he watches this at some point, that we're not calling Dr. Califf old. This is about what Joanne just said, that he was the commissioner and now probably will be again. So just wanted to clarify that before we move on.
Yeah, and that's very true. Thanks. We definitely don't want him to be offended, right? Maybe one day we'll do a webinar with him. But yeah, I think he has so many amazing qualifications for this job. I think it's really a very smart move for this to be Biden's pick. He has a career doing large, huge clinical trials and sort of focused on designing of clinical trials, which of course is something that needs, again, I know we've said the word reform a lot today, but it does need reform. I mean, the way that clinical trials are done in this country is not fit for the 21st century, right? It's not really leveraging, the data, the remote acquisition, all those things that, we couldn't do 20 years ago. So Rob Califf has that, clinical trial experience. And then since he left the agency in 2017, so for those that don't know, he was President Obama's last commissioner, but just for 1 year. So he was confirmed and served a year. And then when President Obama left office, he left as well. So So he was there for a year as commissioner, but he had other roles in the agency before, so he understands, institutionally the agency. And what he did after he left FDA was go and work at Verily Health, which is, an affiliate of Google, and just has learned so much about big data. And, I'm not a big data person, so I look forward to him explaining it to me. But I think, one of the things he's really highlighted as a priority is further, pushing FDA towards leveraging, real world evidence, real world data in their regulatory decision making, in marketing authorizations, making sure it's fit for purpose, which I think, Ben, is like the new buzzword, because it's been in it's in that remote data capture for clinical trials guidance, obviously in the RWED guidances, but Caleb has said it as well in his testimony, making sure the data is fit for purpose. It's not always clear, and that RWD, RWE framework is still very much in development. There were, is it 3 or 4 guidances that came out at the end of last year?
Well, 3 were released in rapid succession, but I think there was another one that came out.
There was one earlier, yeah. So that's just an area that is ripe for, continued refinement, development, obviously education of industry, building it into, their development plans and their marketing packages. So that's a huge priority for him coming in.
Yeah, it fits nicely with FDA's priorities in that space. I mean, FDA has already done a lot of work, as you said, to investigate the uses of RWD, RWE, integrate these ideas of data collection through different means. So the FDA also just released a guidance on the use of digital health technologies and remote collection of data as part of clinical trials. They have the complex innovative trial design pilot. So there are a lot of these activities to explore these uses. Oh, I should also say that the FDA is working through some sort of, we'll call them technical difficulties or regulatory issues. So, one of the issues that's holding up RWD, RWE is how to report it to the agency, because by regulation, FDA can only accept data and records that are actually in a recognized format. So
the standards, the standards for the data. Mm-hmm.
So trying to work through, FDA is trying to work through how that can work with the standards, whether there needs to be a bigger change, which could introduce more delay, but to try to feel that out, to see like how the clinical trials stakeholders can work with the standards and how FDA can work with the standards to allow FDA to even access the data coming in. So it'll be interesting having a person who's really like tied into this world, who can sort of shepherd that along and figure out how it's all gonna work together. But yeah, I think it's really encouraging that he has that experience in big data and can sort of leverage that, being in that industry and staying, because he has this, according to his recent comments at certain meetings, so he has this grand vision for like the unification of like medical clinical data and the big data that's created and used outside of the medical industry. So he's really tied into that and trying to figure out what the FDA can do to facilitate that sort of data transition to a more integrated whole, rather than having rigorously formulated clinical trial data and then like all the other data that's very useful out there, but as you pointed out, that fit for purpose, reliability, relevance issues of that other data, and having a mechanism to distill that down so that it can all be combined together.
Yeah, and more broadly, he has sort of focused on, digital health technology. You just described it, how it touches on everything. But what I think what's really interesting, he's very also cognizant of making sure that this sort of digital health revolution, and as it's applied to drug and device development and clinical research, but just generally as well, that it's not leaving certain aspects, certain groups in our society, certain populations just totally out in the dust, right? Everybody needs to be able to, benefit from these advancements. And so I think that's really interesting. He's very cognizant of that. He's, has said things about, the digital, data capture is great, but I don't want that to take away from the fact that, maybe, people that we would want in our trial don't know how to use that kind of technology, right?
Well, and that's
making sure, yeah.
Well, and that's the use of somebody like Caliph. I mean, they had these innovative designs include things like decentralized trials. So, which allows, if decentralized trials can be used more broadly, it would allow a clinical trial to break out of the institutional setting where they're always conducted now. And there can be more remote assessment, more home aides or investigators that can come in and go to a subject's home rather than have the subject travel a long distance to participate in a trial. So there's a lot of methods that FDA can use to make trials more accessible, and I think using a combination of these techniques is really going to be effective. And that Caliph will help the agency sort of find those techniques that are going to work to both broaden access and then also make better use of digital data and allow that to inform device, drug, biologic development.
Yeah, no, I
think we'll see
really
a lot
excited.
of that. This is also like not just this year, but like in the coming years, long term. These are big changes, and it's really exciting, and we expect a lot to happen in this area.
Yeah, well, I mean, he has a lot to do. I know another area he's sort of highlighted is that he'll focus on is just figuring out how FDA can help, in fighting, the medical misinformation that is proliferating on social media. I know the agency can't do it alone. It's not just an FDA thing, but, the fact that the reputational harm that FDA has, suffered the last few years, the lack of, in some circles, sort of deference to a federal agency, things like that, that just proliferates, the misinformation message. And so I know, again, his sort of 5-year plan is, bring back the agency standing, help people, feel confident in what FDA is saying and the decisions we're making. And, again, sort of how does that all fight or fit into the big picture? I think he's very thoughtful about, those kinds of things. And I think he'll be a great commissioner again, hopefully for longer than a year this time, because as you said, these are not things that are quick projects. But
can't be accomplished in 6 months, right?
Yeah. Oh, here's a guidance. We're good. Well, yep. I know we're almost at 3:15. Our lightning round was other things that are happening that didn't fall into those 5 or 6 buckets that we had. And so, for example, there's been a workshop recently on transparency within AI, machine learning, artificial intelligence, machine learning software. What are the ethical considerations around this kind of software? There's a lot happening on, again, it's all going back to digital health. But AI, ML developments certainly will continue.
Digital health as a whole has been a focus of CDRH, and there's been a lot of development there structurally. In terms of programs, though, and moving things along, FDA has been fairly slow about making real changes. And I think that's CDRH being deliberate, but and like trying to really analyze things from different angles. But FDA is way behind on artificial intelligence and machine learning. We had some posts on this around the workshop on artificial intelligence, machine learning software, and highlighting the fact that this is a long time coming, and the industry has already moved way ahead of FDA on this topic. So it's a place where I'm hoping FDA is going to start picking up the pace as the pandemic, as the resources come back from emergency use during the pandemic. But other side of that too, like the pre-certification pilot program hasn't been much happening there. That was it introduced a few years ago, and there've been a couple updates, but I think the last update we saw, FDA basically said, yeah, we have work to do in almost every area of the pre-cert program, and then we haven't gotten an update since, probably because of the pandemic again. But it's a little unfortunate that we're not seeing a little bit more movement there on the software side, because there's a lot of ground FDA has to make up on that.
Yeah. And I mean, we've talked briefly here and there about the upcoming user fee reauthorization. There's those are generally, people call them, Christmas tree bills. People, members of Congress try to stick other bills on there. I think there's a lot that could go on there. One thing that's interesting is just yesterday, again, the two leaders of the Senate Health Committee released a discussion draft of a pandemic, fairly large, significant, we haven't read the whole thing yet, a pandemic preparedness legislation, and there's tons of FDA proposed reforms in that, including things like using more innovative trial designs when dealing with an emerging pathogen. So again, there's so much that the user fees could bring in terms of change this year. So keep an eye on that. And again, the Prevent Pandemic, I think it's called Prevent Pandemics Act. It hasn't been introduced yet, but even if it doesn't get attached to user fees, it could, move this year or in the next couple of years. So, again, keep an eye on that. Those same two members, actually, maybe not the same two members. Another piece of legislation is the Cures Act 2.0, which has been introduced, has FDA provisions in there. So there's a lot of legislative reform. There's massive cosmetic program reform that's been bipartisan and sort of sitting in Congress for a couple of years now. That likely won't get attached to user fees and is certainly not a high priority during a pandemic. But again, sort of like what happened with the OTC drugs 2 years ago, could get tacked on somewhere. So, and there's a lot of growing recognition that maybe dietary supplements need legislative changes as well. But aside from legislation, I think the other things we want to mention here are, I know in our little write-up for today's webinar, we mentioned that the proposed rule for harmonizing the QSR with ISO 13485 coming any day. It's still coming anyway.
Well, sort of.
I mean,
we'll see. It's been coming very soon for a while. There were a lot of delays on this, so we'll see if it makes it through OMB this time. But
that's the update. It's now at OMB as of, I believe, January 5th. It's under OMB review, which that's the last hurdle before FDA can publish it. For those that.
We'll probably see it later. We'll probably see it later this year, but maybe not in like the next few months, but maybe towards the middle or the end of the year. So
So that's obviously a major.
But that's big. That's huge. I mean,
for CDRH,
Right. The QSR is already sort of aligned already with 1345. There aren't, there are some differences, but but this will provide more of a harmonization, allowing for single audit, MedSap. Which is actually sort of interesting to think about. And this is the last thing I'll say about it, because harmonization brings with it sort of an expectation of complying with both the QSR and 1345, which would allow FDA to, or Congress potentially, to require companies to register for MedSap, like in Canada, which already requires medical device manufacturers to register for MedSap. So I'm not sure whether that will actually happen, but it does make things a little easier for the agency if everyone is on the single audit program. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's sort of attached to this whole change. But again, maybe not this year, but maybe in coming years, that'll be more of an expectation or requirement.
Yeah, well, but just in terms of, for those of you that are, subject to the QSR, obviously keep an eye out for that proposed rule that, again, hopefully will come out this year and in the next few months, as long as the OMB review, goes well. I guess they could always send it back. Well, hi, Kate.
Hi, thank you both so much. This is a ton of information. And I'm sure it's really useful to our audience. This is relevant to everything they do on a daily basis. I did have just one question I wanted to run by you if you have a minute. What are your thoughts with regard to over-the-counter user fees for manufacturers? When you were talking about a small business, maybe it's a physician-owned product and they're using a contract manufacturer to produce it. They're selling it out of their office. Maybe they're selling it on Amazon. Is there any kind of small business relief for that type of entity, or are they going to be subject to a full manufacturer fee?
The contract manufacturer or the physician office?
The owner of the product.
Haven't looked at that in particular. So yeah. I would want to check, but I don't, the physician office selling the product shouldn't be subject to a fee at all. It's the manufacturers, like the physical manufacturers.
So it's often in the regulations, creating the formulation that is then produced by another entity is considered manufacturing for FDA purposes. Are they excluded from the user fee requirement if it's an over-the-counter monograph product? And it's a tricky question.
I would have to check because I haven't looked at those regs for a while, or that statute for a while. I don't know, but I'm happy to look and send you the answer.
Thank you. I just wanted to see if you had heard anything more than we had. We do have.
It's all very new.
It is just manufacturers. I don't believe it's defined to include the formulation developer. Okay. But we could definitely check. Sorry, go ahead.
But also with a lot of user fees, there are waivers, there are reductions in fees that are available. So I don't know how it applies specifically to in this case, but FDA has allowed small businesses, and others to get either a waiver on some fees or a reduction in fees. So that is possible, right, Joanne? Just like comparing it to other user fee acts.
Yeah, usually the waivers and exemptions are not from the facility fees; they're from the application fees. For example, for a device, right? There's no small business version of the facility payment. But I was just looking at the definition here in terms of OTC monograph drug facility. It says engaged in manufacturing or processing. Manufacturer processing. Yeah, I don't think
which is typical.
It's just manufacturing processing. It wouldn't be, Kate. It would not be. Again, someone shouldn't take this as their legal advice. They should confirm. But based just on the definition, it would not be the formulation developer. It would just be the manufacturing and processing locations for that drug. So the CMO in your example. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we covered a lot of the other questions that were submitted, the pre-cert program and real world evidence incorporation. So thank you. This is one of our favorite topics to bring before our audience every year. And I know that this is going to be useful information to them for the entire coming year. So thank you both very much for your time.
Oh, it was fun. Thanks for inviting us, Kate.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Great afternoon.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.